Welcome to the piXL Drone Show. We are recording this on a Friday afternoon. It's about 5 p.m. here, May 7th, so it's almost weekend. However, before we roll into the weekend, we have Brendan Schulman, the Vice President of Policy and Legal Affairs from a company you might have heard of, DJI. I think it's the world's largest drone manufacturer. So, Brendan, thank you very much for joining us. I know it's the weekend is almost starting, but we have you for the next hour to talk about a lot of things. And before we get started, I think many people will know Brendan, of course, from appearance in podcasts, as well as writing articles. He's also been a member of many committees from the FAA, including recently the Drone Advisory Committee. So again, Brendan, thank you for joining us today, and we'll get started right away with the first question.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here. I'm well, thank you.
Awesome. Well, let's dive in right away. The top things on your mind. I mean, let's start with the Mavic 3. I mean, remote ID and perhaps the Texas easement bill, if you want.
Do you want to start in Texas? All right.
let's start in Texas.
Sure. Well, that's a timely topic. So I think as you know, and I think I saw you wrote an article about it today. There's a bill that's proposed in Texas and apparently also a few other states near Texas that sort of relates to a topic that's gone through some cycles over the past few years in terms of the potential role for state and local government in regulating drones. And I know if you go way back, you may recall I was co-chair of a drone advisory committee task group on this question of, could we come up with a creative recommendation for the FAA or for the federal government on how to sort of reconcile the local interest in having some control or governance over drone operations while still preserving a uniform set of rules, aviation safety, the authority of the FAA, et cetera. There were some recommendations that came out of the DAC a while ago. Of course, it's a few years later, so there may be other ideas and input now. But what we're seeing this year in Texas is this bill that sort of like jumps forward and tries to do the following. It says that if you're flying a drone beyond visual line of sight, which, as you know, is mostly a futuristic application, except we can today fly BVLOS if you have a visual observer. So arguably, this really actually does apply to many operations today. So some people might say, oh, this is just about future drone use. It's actually about current drone use, if you think about it. So if you're flying BVLOS, you will be limited to flying in avigation corridors established by the state. So that's basically like predefined navigation routes over roads, things like that, with the intent to kind of keep the drones away from private property or overflight of private property. And it also includes contemplation of charging permit fees by the minute of flight time. So it really connects to a lot of the proposals we've seen a while ago, like the Drone Federalism Act and some other suggestions that we should do something about empowering the states and cities to regulate drones, particularly at low altitudes. Now, my concern about it, which echoes the concern of the entire industry, is that it doesn't solve a problem if there is a problem, but it creates a huge problem for the industry. If people have to only fly over certain roads or pay a toll or a tax just to fly, it really will impede innovation and life-saving missions and economic development for no reason. It doesn't solve a problem. If you're worried about privacy, you can fly higher with a camera, a zoom camera, or you could fly within visual line of sight. So what's the point of this bill that doesn't solve any problems and yet imposes limitations and taxes upon the industry? So it's a big concern. I saw that a couple of trade associations have weighed in against it, AUVSI and CTA. And I think it's something that I've seen people engaged in Texas speak out against it and other states. And I think it's something we need to advocate against.
Yeah, I can imagine that one of your concerns would also be that if Texas comes up with its own set of rules and system, that every other state might have a slightly different version with slightly different fees and slightly different regulations.
Yeah, yes, and you might even have conflicting local rules. Also, what if the avigation corridor is a certain, let's say it's 350 feet. Well, that's more dangerous, higher risk because you're closer to manned air traffic. And so you're not, how do you reconcile the FAA's approach to drone safety and regulation with state and local, I think is a big concern.
Well, and I think also, I know DJI is not a service supplier, or I guess like Kitty Hawk, for example, where you provide LAANC approval. But where does the pilot get the information once you have all these local regulation? It's hard enough at the moment to be able to find that information. And I know DJI has their own set of approval with airspace and their own restrictions. But then, for you as a manufacturer, I can imagine that this becomes an even bigger nightmare.
Well, I think there's probably the expectation that those rules, those corridors and flight permit fees and taxes would be charged through some kind of UTM system, which could be run or managed at the state or local level. So I think, as I said before, there's tremendous opposition from the industry against this proposal, but you might expect that, in the past, we've seen certain companies support individualized local regulation because they would then profit from it by providing a solution to all the confusion out there. So I think that could well be part of what's behind the scenes here.
And I know also this is something that DJI, I know in your response to the NPRM, this is something that you guys had put out, and I'm sure you had something to do with that response, with the fact that we need to keep the airspace free. And I 100% agree with this. This is also something that I had in my response. Can you talk about the consequences of having a pay-to-play type of airspace?
Well, the way it came up in our NPRM on remote ID is, look, we're myself personally, and of course our company, is a strong proponent of innovation, getting technology into people's hands, because that's how you see all these life-saving missions. We're up to 590 people who've been rescued using a drone. You can see all those on our online map. So the benefits are here, and the reason there's benefit is that the technology is now widely in use. It's accessible, it's affordable, it's very capable. So anything that impedes those outcomes by imposing costs or making things complicated or confusing is going to damage all this amazing benefit that we enjoy and that I care about personally. And so when I see a local proposal or a state proposal like this, which would complicate things, make it harder to comply, or create conflicting rules, or impose costs, or the need, for example, with the NPRM, the need to do both broadcast and network remote ID, connect to a system and pay monthly fees just to identify who you are. To me, that not only does that cost money, but it reduces compliance. It makes remote ID less successful. So, since we're proponents of remote ID and we know how important it is to government, we want it to succeed. You have to make it easy. You have to make it low cost. And that's why, we wrote 80 pages about how to make it low cost. And I'm pleased to see the FAA outcome, I think, is the easiest, quickest, cheapest way to get remote ID done. Something that probably most people won't even think about because it's going to be built into the drone. You turn it on and you're done. Rather than having to connect and deal with subscription and payment information and internet connectivity. So I think it's a good solution. You could apply that philosophy to any number of policy issues, including this one. If the government's going to make it more difficult or more expensive to use a drone, they're going to hurt innovation, and that's something I oppose. It's something DJI will oppose.
Yeah, 100% agree with that. What do you see as the biggest issue with remote ID as it is right now in the final rule? What do you think is the biggest obstacle to making it work and making it a success?
Well, we've got some technical development still left to do. The FAA rules just set out what needs to be done, but doesn't specify in technical detail how to do it. Mm-hmm. That's where industry consensus standards come into play. And this is true of a lot of FAA regulations. The FAA says, do this thing, but they don't want to tell industry how to do it because that would be very prescriptive. It would they're not the experts in the technology. They just have a safety goal in mind.
Mm-hmm.
So what's happening now, and it really started 2 years ago at ASTM International, is the industry and the FAA and other stakeholders are working together on a set of standards that anyone can implement that would perform remote ID, and to do so using either a broadcast approach, which would use Wi-Fi or Bluetooth signals, or an internet network approach over the internet, which is not going to be mandatory by the FAA, but it is in the standard for anyone who wants to use it. So that's, now that the rule is done, the industry understands with certainty what needs to happen, and we can develop the technical solution to do it. That's going to take probably at least a few more months just to wrap up, and then people will have a blueprint for actually implementing remote ID, which is why the effective date of the rule is April, but the compliance dates are not until next year and the year after, because we have to do the technical work. Now, you asked that as if it was a hurdle or a challenge. I don't think it is. I think it's just the kind of work that needs to be done. And again, our goal has been, this just needs to be done simply in a way that anyone can implement with the least disruption to the equipment out there. So our hope is to be able to update the drones with a software update. And I wrote a blog post about that a couple weeks ago, that, this should be as easy as a software update and you're done. Now, that may not always be true for other brands or certain models of ours that are older, but that should be the goal. And for the other models, of course, there's the module alternative where you can just add the broadcast module to the aircraft and you're done that way. So there will be easy paths to compliance. So we just have some technical work to do, and then I hope it will be straightforward to get implemented in time for the deadlines.
Oh, that's good news.
That sounds pretty good. And if you look at different countries around the world, are some other countries looking at the US and waiting for the FAA and the manufacturers here to figure out how to make this work so they can implement something along the same lines, or is the US standing alone on this in this area?
Well, actually, the U.S. is behind. You may be surprised to hear the European Union finalized the remote ID rules, I think, about a year ago, and their compliance deadline is this summer. So they have the same technical question of how do you get it done, and I'm pleased to say that we're seeing an international convergence. Right? We just want to do this one way. Everyone should just want to do this one way, and so the Europeans are. My understanding is that they are likely to adopt the ASTM international standard. I think that may also be true in Japan. So the idea is, you have a drone, it's gonna comply wherever you need it to. If you take it on vacation, if you're a photographer who goes on assignment overseas, hopefully, no promises, but hopefully we're just going to get it done, and then it will be the same solution everywhere. And that's just good for the whole industry, that we don't have to keep reinventing the wheel. So actually, the EU is ahead of the US in terms of compliance deadlines. We do all need to finalize the standards so that happens. We're getting there, but my hope is that in most major jurisdictions around the world, remote ID will just be done the same way, and therefore be very easy and inexpensive for everyone using a drone.
Yeah, because I can see the hurdle for an aircraft manufacturer like you guys who sell drones all over the world. And I had a question on my list of talking about the airspace restriction, because as we all know, the DJI airspace restriction is a little bit different than the FAA restriction. And I'm guessing that this is something that you guys did in order to be compliant all over the world and follow, because I know you follow Part 77 surfaces around airports. Can you talk a little bit more about the decision to not follow the grids on the LAANC FAA and have a requirement to not fly when DJI tells you can't fly, but the FAA says you can, and vice versa?
Sure. And I know there's sometimes a little confusion about this. I think what's important to remember is that we're talking about a geofencing system. Geofencing is a built-in limitation of the product that's intended to add some steps before you fly in a place that is high risk and will create an aviation safety or national security problem. So when you design that kind of feature, you're going to want to look at the highest risk. Where are places that the risk is so high that you don't want the drone flying as a default matter? Now, in general, we don't want to take away anyone's ability to fly easily and use the product, enjoy it, get your mission done, right? That's our goal is, ease of use, of course. User friendliness is what we put into all the products. But we have to do something about safety and security when it comes to those high-risk locations. So what do? We look at what the actual high risk is all about and turn off the drone in those places by default so that you have to take some extra steps to get unlocked, as we sometimes say, to fly there. That's not because we're telling you can't. We just think extra steps are warranted because you're literally going to fly in the path of an airliner based on where we've put the geofencing. So then the question is, well, where do you do it? And we don't have a yes-no system, right? We don't say you can't fly, you can't fly. We've got different levels of risk. We've got what we call restricted zone, which is like right over the runway and the approach path. We've got authorization zone, which is basically a self-unlocking set of steps. You need a verified account, and then you can do it on your own. You don't even need to talk to us. Then you've got enhanced warning zones, and you've got warning zones. So we have 4 layers of zones, and they're all based on risk. And yes, FAA Part 77, which has to do with obstacles on approach to an airport, ICAO Annex 14. These are all long-standing, decades-long risk-based principles for planes coming in and out of airports, and we based our system on that. And it's a global system, so it's not going to match the rules. It may or may not apply to you. Like, you may be authorized to fly everywhere because you are the FAA. We don't know who you are when you fly our drone. So we can't tell you, yes, you can or can't fly the drone. What we can do is put in place this default extra step, and we call it geofencing. When LAANC came along, I'm not sure why. Maybe it was just sort of the limitation or the way they wanted to approach it. The FAA said, okay, we're gonna do something we never did before. We're gonna divide controlled airspace into 1 mile square grids, and we're gonna ask the local facility, what is the height above. What is the altitude below which there's basically no risk because no planes ever fly there? And that we're going to give you, we're still going to need approval, but approval will be automatic. Okay, that's kind of an interesting and different way of thinking about it. And I think they did that because they needed a way to create this automated system based on almost zero risk. So if you have a 200-foot altitude grid square and you apply to fly at 100 feet, automatic approval. Why? There's nothing there. But that's not really the risk profile at the airport, which ICAO and FAA for decades have said is this sort of bow tie shape around the runway. So look, the system exists the way it does in our technology because it's a risk-based model that's global in nature, and it corresponds to the airport characteristics and not the FAA grids. And by the way, those grids altitudes keep changing, right? So whether it's the air traffic facility staffing or sometimes the airports are completely turned off to LAANC. Plus, you can get approval to fly above the number or even in a zero grid if you take extra steps. So again, we're not going to create a system that says you can't fly here. We still would need a way to unlock the airspace in the zero grid. So the bottom line is, like, wherever you want to fly, if you're authorized, go to the website, fill out the form, attach your documentation. It will unlock you in less than 30 minutes, and usually within 5 minutes, and you're done. But sometimes people say, why isn't this the same as FAA? And the answer is, we created it before, and it's based on risk. It's not based on whether you're approved to fly, if that makes sense.
Oh, I love your explanation. It makes total sense to me, and thank you for saying that. I hope it helped explain the confusion to a lot of people. We just put a video out. The reason I'm asking is we just put a video out explaining the difference between those two, and we get a lot of questions saying exactly what I just said. So I hope this helps folks answer.
Hope so.
I've heard people complain about geofencing, but the way you explain it, it really is a safety feature. What do you think of other competing brands that even market and say, well, we don't have any of that. We don't have any of those types of restrictions, including geofencing?
So in our 2019 Elevating Safety white paper, and some of you may have been at the event in Washington, when we released that. We were quite clear. We think some form of geofencing should be implemented by every manufacturer. Now, we're not going to tell you how to do that. There's no right answer. There's no FAA guidance on how to do geofencing. There are some suggestions from the UAS safety team and perhaps some others. We actually consulted with AAAE, which is Airport Association, and with AOPA. So we had some aviation stakeholder input into how could we, that's when we went from the circles to the bow ties. How could we make this more focused on risk? Because circles are not really the risk profile at an airport, and neither are square grids, 1 mile grids, but the bow ties really are. So we got that advice from them. Look, I think manufacturers should implement some geofencing, especially at the major airports. Like, there's just no reason for anyone's drone to be flying over Dulles Airport when the technology exists to, create a set of maps and keep the drone from flying because you've already got a GPS receiver on board and the drone knows where it is. So I think it's a deficiency and a shortcoming. Any sophisticated drone manufacturer in 2021 should be putting in a geofencing feature. Absolutely. Because otherwise, if there's an incident that could have been, or an accident, God forbid, that could have been prevented by this technology that literally has been in drone products now for pretty much a decade, that's going to be on us. Like, people will ask us, why didn't the industry do better, do something that they could have done? So I do think it's important. I know not everyone agrees, and I know that there are companies that market this as a feature. We're better than DJI because we aren't doing geofencing. Okay, like, I get it. You have to differentiate yourself from the market leader, but at the expense of safety is really not cool.
We know that local municipalities and local governments, they can define where you can take off and where you can land your drone. We also know that, I think it was back in 2018, the FAA stated that they are the only government agency that has exclusive rights over managing airspace in the United States. Has the FAA ever been challenged by anybody, as far as you know, as what is navigable airspace and where does that start and where does that stop? And can states come up with different rules like what they're trying to do now in Texas to create tollways, if you will, in the sky?
Yeah. So in addition to the Texas bill being a bad idea, it is in conflict with federal preemption principles, which have held that the federal government, in particular the FAA, is in charge of managing the airspace, including the routes where airplanes fly. The one case that comes to mind on that issue is from a few years ago, the Newton, Massachusetts case. That's where Newton, Massachusetts had an ordinance saying you could not fly a drone below 400 feet, I think. It's been a few years, so if I get the details wrong, I apologize. But a resident of that town sued the town on the basis of preemption and won, with a finding that, that is the jurisdiction of the FAA. The town cannot, which effectively would ground all the drones because the FAA rule is below 400 feet. So that gives you no space. Now, you can think of a million different variations on this. What about 1 foot off the ground? Okay, like, people will debate sort of where the line is. But I think it's clear in cases that have come up for decades, typically with traditional aviation, that the local cities can't regulate where planes fly. Now, you're right, when it comes to takeoff and landing, because that usually involves an airport, that's a zoning issue, that's a land use issue. And so, to the extent cities are looking for a way to control something, there's that, but it doesn't really solve the problem because, first of all, you can take off and land on your hand, but setting aside the practical thing, the takeoff and landing principle is for aircraft, like for big aircraft, and a drone that's taking off or landing just doesn't present the same kind of community issues as a helicopter, which is a very different safety issue. Noise, nuisance, facilities. You need aviation fuel on the ground, for example, if you have an airport, usually. So again, this is a really good example of longstanding law and policy that was designed for one thing, and now we have a different kind of technology. What should we do? And this is why there's an ongoing debate, like in Texas and at the DAC, and Senator Lee has introduced his, I think it's called Drone Integration and Zoning Act, which would have put a 200-foot line in the sky and actually would take jurisdiction away from the FAA. So I think that these debates will continue, but where we are right now is sure, takeoff and landing, because that was designed to govern airports, is a way for local government to control and regulate where they take off and land. But no one really cares about that with drones. People care about where they're flying. And so hopefully some kind of creative solution will emerge to actual problems. By the way, these two topics are connected. I really do think that with remote ID coming, many of the concerns or fears that communities have about drones, like privacy, will be solved by the technology. You will have a way to enforce existing privacy law or nuisance or noise, things like that, without restricting the drone flight, simply by holding people accountable who are actually doing bad things. So if you actually had a drone doing a peeping Tom kind of activity, well, we even had a case like that in New York, upstate New York. Someone was prosecuted. This is the Beesmer case. Yeah, Beesmer, a guy named Beesmer, was flying outside a medical office where he had dropped off his mother for an appointment. He had just bought his new Phantom and was checking it out and flying around the parking lot, and literally was charged with unlawful surveillance under existing New York statutes. This was probably about 5 or 6 years before I joined DJI, so probably 6 or 7 years ago. And it went all the way through trial. He was acquitted. He was found not guilty, not because the law wouldn't cover that activity if he was guilty, but because he wasn't actually spying on anyone, because the windows of the building had a mirrored finish. He could not have been, and this is the daytime, so he could not have been taking pictures of people being examined in the office building. Now, imagine that scenario with someone actually and intentionally trying to do unlawful surveillance using a drone. I believe they should be prosecuted and convicted. The problem with drones is that they fly away. You don't always catch the person standing there in the parking lot. This guy was not trying to hide what he was doing because he wasn't doing anything wrong. So he was caught. Someone trying to do something wrong will probably not get caught, except now we've got remote ID. So I'm hopeful that as remote ID comes in, despite all the complaints, I'm sure we're going to hear about it from the user community because it is a new requirement, and of course there is a concern about pilot safety. That is a real thing. But I think it will start to solve this accountability and enforcement challenge at the local level, which right now, with the lack of solution, is causing cities to say, we just don't want the drones here. We want to restrict where they fly. We want to limit the flight. Why? Because we can't hold anyone accountable. The drone's flying away. So I think these two issues we've been talking about actually come together nicely.
So would you go as far as saying that if remote ID is being applied in a sensible way, that it might actually create more freedom for us to fly drones in areas or in ways that we currently are prohibited to do?
I think in the long run, yes, because we can't, part of what we need as an industry and as a community is social acceptance, right? Like we can't continue to live in an era where people don't understand what drones do and don't welcome them. But some of the concerns are real. Like we know, I'll be the first person to hold up that, remember the Lego box with the ridiculous scene of a drone stealing a statue from the city square? It was absurd. So I'm the first one to say, look, some of these concerns are outrageous, but some are real, and that means we need accountability. Just like license plates on cars, it's not acceptable for people to be causing concerns, including putting airplanes at risk, without an accountability mechanism, and that's what remote ID does. So I think at first there'll be some anxiety about it, but I think we'll get used to it, just like we got used to license plates. Sure, it'd be great to drive your car anonymously, right? You'd probably speed a lot more often, and that's the problem, right? We need a way for people to feel responsible for their flight. That's going to be good for the whole community, even if some people are going to scream and kick and say, don't track what I'm doing with the drone. honestly, the technology raises enough legitimate concerns that we can't believe that's the outcome for us. So I do think that in the long run, having a remote ID will help us prevent some of those harsh policies that otherwise would restrict what we do.
It was Kenji from the DSPA who had said, when we had cell phones, people were afraid that people were going to take pictures in public, and now you have a camera available all the time, and then eventually people get used to it. So I think, Brendan, what you were saying is eventually I think people will get used to it. Once we start seeing delivery drones flying all over, I think it's going to become a much more normal thing in everybody's life. So sorry, Haye, go ahead.
No, I was going to tap right into that, basically. I mean, delivery drones, let's say UPS flying or FedEx flying or Amazon flying their drones and making deliveries versus, let's say, somebody flying an FPV drone in a local park. I mean, those are very different ways of using a drone, right? I mean, do you think that the FAA distinguishes sufficiently between the different types of drones and the different ways that people fly their drones when it comes to remote ID and safety and the regulation in general?
Yeah, yes and no. They make distinctions that are useful, but they probably don't make enough distinctions because it's too hard. There's a limit to how granular an agency can get in terms of its regulations. So, we're living with this 55-pound category. Years ago, before I was at DJI, even I was advocating for a micro category. Let's take the drones that are at the low end. Let's say 4 pounds, 2 pounds, 3 pounds, 4 pounds, and say those are so small and therefore safer than 50 pounds that we should regulate them differently. Well, Congress had already set a 55-pound, small UAS category. So it was tough for FAA to do anything other than rules for the entire 55-pound category. But we do have a cutoff at 0.55 pounds for registration, and now remote ID and Category 1 flight over people. So we're seeing a distinction for the smallest drones, perhaps absurdly small, or I should say light, but it is there. And with the mini series, we actually are creating products that are quite capable, even in that really lightweight category. And that's great for safety, because if people are attracted to the mini because it's light and lets you do more things, or lets you, if you care about avoiding remote ID, I don't think you should. But if you do, or you want to fly over people, you're going to do it now with a safer product in the air if there is a collision or if you hit someone on the ground or in the air. So, that's one way the FAA draws a distinction, but probably not enough. If you read our NPRM comment, we said in there that weight cutoff doesn't really make sense, right? We should be looking at the capability of drones. We should require remote ID on drones that cause the kinds of concerns that got us to this in the first place. And I think we can all acknowledge those are basically FPV type capabilities, the ability to pilot a drone easily because you have a remotely viewable camera and a highly capable, or you have a GPS navigation device with a ground control station app showing you where the drone is. That's the problem, right? The reason this technology caused a problem and traditional model airplanes didn't is that, and I've been flying traditional model airplanes since the mid-90s, you fly them in circles, you can't go very far, you have to be pretty skilled. That's not really the same. Look, there are risks with that, but it's not the same thing as being able to precisely navigate a drone hundreds of feet away remotely because you have a camera, and if you take your hands off, it's stable, so you don't really need much skill. So let's solve problems and regulate things that are causing problems. That's where the FAA isn't making enough of a distinction, but the distinction is very hard because then they would have to, at the front end, say, okay, which of all these flying things on the market, everything from 1 pound park flyers to 50-pound autonomous delivery drones, which of those should we regulate at the front end and require remote ID or registration? And now you got a front end, you wouldn't be able to get products on the market because you'd be waiting for the FAA to decide, is this a sufficiently complicated enough or sophisticated enough drone that it requires remote ID? And that would just sort of grind everything to a halt. So you've got some useful distinctions from the FAA, but then you also have kind of a lack of bandwidth for them to make all the distinctions that could matter. So I think they're doing pretty well given those limitations. things kind of make sense, but they're not perfect.
Two follow-up questions quick about this. So where does the 250 gram limit come from? And secondly, how successful has the mini series and now the mini 2 been for DJI? I mean, is this where drones are going for, let's say, the hobbyist and recreational pilot, like super small but still very capable drones?
250 grams came out of the registration task force that I was on in late 2015. We had 3 days in the room together to come up with a threshold for remote ID, well, a recommended threshold. It's the FAA's rule, but our job was to recommend something. And it was based on some calculations relating to research that, as we found out later, once we had time to look at it, because we only had 3 days in the room, but once we figured it out, it turned out it was based on, and I have a whole paper on this if you really want to read about it, but it goes all the way back to some research in, I think, the 1950s or 60s about nuclear war simulations and how likely you were to die if you get hit with a small piece of shrapnel when there's nuclear war and there are no hospitals. And the answer is, like, if you get cut in that scenario, you have like a 10% chance of dying because you're going to bleed out because you can't get stitches. Like it, so that, like, if you trace back, like, how do we get to it? It's based on the assumption that like a 70 joule impact, an impact that transfers 70 joules of energy has a 30% chance of killing you. But where does that come from? It comes from this crazy, like, simulation from the 50s or 60s about nuclear. Anyway, so we took a closer look at that. And if you did the math, there's some other assumptions in there. If you did the math again, you might conclude that the threshold really should be 2 kilograms, not 250 grams. But it's sort of too late, even though in that registration task force, we all kind of agreed that this should be revisited once we had better science. So you could revisit it. But I think from a social acceptance point of view, people seem comfortable with the half-pound cutoff. Now, in popularity, I don't think it's because of the lack of registration or these other. I just think the product is really good. Like, the mini series is amazing. It's highly portable. It's affordable. The Mini 2 is a really good camera. So yes, it's doing well. I can't tell you how well, but it is a very popular product. I think because of its features, not because it's just below the FAA registration cutoff.
I love the cage that comes with it, but how much weight does that add on? Doesn't that put it over the threshold? Isn't there kind of an issue with it, that cage, which is great. I mean, I fly it around the house all the time with my daughter, and it'll bump off walls. But as far as the rule saying that you can't have anything that will lacerate your skin, so you need to have a full propeller guard, that obviously puts it over the 250 gram threshold, doesn't it? Is there a way you're going to address that with future models or in the future?
So, great question. No, it's a great question. The proposed rule is, you're talking about flight over people, category 1.
Yeah.
So this is only about whether you can fly over people under Part 107. Flying over people, not under Part 107, is governed by community-based organization safety code. So you could fly over people with the Mini if there's a community-based organization safety code that allows you to. You'll have to consult that. But if you're under Part 107, the new rules apply, and they say yes. Not only do you have to, for Category 1, you have to be at or under 0.55 pounds, and you have to either turn off or shield the propellers from laceration, which was not in their original proposal. So that sounds to me like prop guards or prop cage. If you put the prop guards on the Mini 2, you will be over 0.55 pounds. Some people have said, well, I'm going to get the Japanese battery, because we created a Japanese battery because there the registration, well, some of the regulatory cutoffs there are 200 grams. And we wanted to provide that product to enhance safety and encourage people to use the safest product. We created a variant on the battery. But it's actually also a variant on the aircraft, which is a little bit different weight. So the question came up, and I spent some time internally. When the final rule came out, I said, okay, so it's not just, we have to do something with the prop cage. It's not just the aircraft, and that's different from the proposal. So what are we going to do? The Japanese battery is not certified for sale in the U.S. You have to do UL type certifications. So we don't sell it in the U.S. But if we did, would it get you to Category 1? And what I learned, to my surprise, is no, it wouldn't, because the Japanese battery plus the US Mavic Mini 2, US Mini 2, plus the prop cage is over 0.55 pounds. Barely, but it is. So are there things you could do? Like I saw a video of someone cutting out pieces of the prop guard. I'm not going to advise you, but it doesn't have to be an off-the-shelf product. Maybe someone will create a lower weight prop cage. Maybe we'll do something in a future model or with an accessory. I really can't speak to future plans. We obviously want people to get the most out of the technology. I think flight over people is going to save lives. Obviously, it's beneficial if done safely, which it can be if you're under 0.55 pounds. But technically, we're not quite there because of the way the final rule came out. It's a little frustrating. So would I predict that at some point we would probably do something? Yeah. I can't tell you what that is. I think there probably are things you could do right now. I think if you somehow got a Japanese Mini 2 and the Japanese battery, again, make sure that you're allowed to use it in the US. I'm not going to speak to compliance, but in theory, that might work. Or if you found a way to remove some weight from the cage. But we actually sent out a survey to users about this and got some feedback on, just how likely are you actually, use this kind of accessory package if we did it. And according to people internally, it was sort of interesting. Like there wasn't overwhelming demand. I think because maybe it was new and it was, it just applies to Part 107, right? So these are just people who are commercial or government and want to fly over people and want to accept the capabilities of the current Mini, which is pretty good, but it's not our best camera. So maybe that's a small group of people. I don't know. I think it will grow. So at some point, maybe we'll have something, but I can't tell you what at this point.
Yeah. Are you aware of the WeMe? I believe it's X8 Mini. I just covered it for DP Review. And it's, their app kind of suspiciously looks like yours.
Imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. So,
yeah, it is. No, my editor just reached out. He said, just write an article on it. But as I was going through it, and they have a pro battery that makes it 238 grams. And I just wanted your opinion on it. I was curious.
Hey, look, if you know me, you'll know that I love new products. I love competition. I think it's great for people to be figuring out. You can also go and buy a parachute. Like there are solutions to this that are not DJI specific, and that's great. Like I love the innovation out there, and if someone can get a Category 1 aircraft to market now, so that people can fly over people and save lives and do great things, I am a big supporter of that. I'm not in our marketing department. Like to me, the rules need to support innovation regardless of which company is putting out the products, and that's good for everyone.
So Brendan, by the way, you and I had a discussion on the Mini. This is the Japanese Mini right here. I actually bought it from Japan, and it is, like you said, 3 grams over. If you use the Japanese Mini in the American version of the Mini, it's 3 grams over. So you have to shed 3 grams because the Japanese version is 10 grams lighter than the aircraft is different. It's 10 grams of a difference. But yeah, I've flown this over people, and it is legal, I guess, in the US now. So that's the only way that I've found to have a good camera with a 4K camera to be able to fly over people. So I wanted to shift gears, and not really shift gears, actually kind of go with what Kara was just saying, talking about approval to fly over people with Category 1. Now with Category 2 and Category 3, there is a process that the manufacturer has to go through, the means of compliance, the declaration of compliance. Can you talk, and maybe not DJI specific, but about what that process looks like from a manufacturer standpoint, what the FAA wants you guys to do before they give you the rubber stamp, and maybe for listeners, what the difference is between means and compliance and declaration of compliance, because these are terms that we use a lot, but I think a lot of people don't really understand what it takes from the behind the scene from you as the manufacturer and what you have to do.
Sure. So first, it's important to understand what that flight over people rule actually is for categories 2 and 3. It is not a kinetic energy measurement. Some people think, oh, if my drone doesn't transfer, was it 15 joules? I forget. It doesn't, 17? If it doesn't transfer that energy, then I'm good to fly over people. That's not what it says. What it says is the drone can't cause more harm than a rigid object that transfers that amount of energy to a person when it impacts them, which means the industry needs a way of measuring that injury level. It's an injury level test. It is not a kinetic energy test. The kinetic energy tells you what type of injury you need to measure. You need to take the rigid object, which is like, you know, a block of wood kind of thing, throw it against a test dummy so that you get a transfer of that kinetic energy. And then you take your drone and you do the same thing and you see, is this test dummy more injured than it was with the block? And if the answer is no, now you've got a drone that can fly over people. That test methodology, injury testing, needs to be done out there, standardized, and then accepted by the FAA as being sufficient to meet the requirements of category 2 and 3. That hasn't been done yet. There's at least one industry group, or I should say academic group. The FAA's Assure program, which is a consortium of universities. They're working on a test methodology so that any manufacturer can use their impact model, go out there, take your drone, test it against the crash test dummies, and for lacerations, I think it might require like fake skin, or at least shield or turn off the props. But it's pretty clear that the FAA was so conservative, and this was, if you go back and read the comments on the NPRM years ago, people were complaining this is like way too conservative, but they kept it there. So it's so conservative that you're clearly going to need like a parachute or some other way to stop a relatively, heavier drone when it's falling. I think I could be wrong, right? We could be surprised because we haven't done the testing, right? Like you need to have the drone hit a test object and then see how it compares to a block. But my guess is that you need to slow that drone down with a parachute, or you could have an airbag, you could have a balloon, like some kind of like. There's no one solution. The FAA is not prescribing a certain way. You don't have to have a parachute, but realistically, you probably will need to slow the drone down so that it doesn't hurt someone any more than the rigid block. Okay, that's not done yet. So the reason why the rule's effective and there are 0 category 2 or 3 products out there is that just like with remote ID, we need the standards. Now that we know what the goal is, we need the standards to technically show you how to achieve the outcome, and then you need the FAA to accept it. And that's what the means of compliance and declaration of compliance. Means of compliance is just someone goes to the FAA and says, hey, this is how we propose to meet your compliance requirements. For example, here's how we've set up our impact test. And the FAA says, okay, yes, this is an acceptable means of compliance. The goal would be to have an industry consensus means of compliance that anyone could then use. Because the FAA is accepted at once, the next company that comes in and says we're going to do it the same way and we've met the requirements, the FAA would say, oh yes, we know this methodology because is developed by Assure. You do the same test and you get results that match. You'll be approved too. So that's the means of compliance. The declaration is sort of the formality. It's the paperwork. The declaration says we've done that test. And we've reached the result that we needed to. This product is basically, declared to be compliant with the FAA's requirements, which is the rules and the means of compliance. So it's a little technical, but the basic idea here is like the industry. People can either go directly to the FAA with their means of compliance and get approval, or the industry as a whole could come up with with a way of doing it that FAA will then accept more easily when anyone comes forward and says, we're going to do it the same way. So that's what's in development. By the way, it's the same thing with remote ID. We need the means of compliance and then the declaration. So again, the means that the industry is going to have sort of like a consensus approach. That's the ASTM standard. This is the way, but it's not the only. If someone could create their own standard for remote ID and go get it accepted by the FAA, and that would be fine. But the idea is like, why do things twice? So again, let's have a consensus approach to the means of compliance that works for everyone. Get the FAA to bless it, and then anyone who comes along and wants to use it is going to have a smoother path to FAA.
That's awesome. I love the explanation. Do you know of any other countries that have approached flying over people with similar or maybe a different set of regulation?
You're testing my memory a bit. I think France has had a parachute type of requirement for a while, but it was very early and not really thought out. It was more like if you fly in certain areas, you need a parachute without any sort of like, injury or impact testing threshold. I think though, for most places don't allow you to fly over people, and so this is an area where the FAA really ought to be taking the lead, even though this is very, very delayed. This is a rule we could have used a few years ago. Mm-hmm. There was an aviation rulemaking committee on this as well, and that was back in 2016, I think. So it's been a long time coming, but still, I think the FAA will probably have a leadership role on this because it's the first kind of standard I know of for flight over people, unless I'm forgetting something.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with any other ones in the world, but I had a question about your white paper. You talked about the white paper, Elevate, that you did in 2019. And I know part of it was you wanted to have AirSense installed on all the different drones over 250 grams that come out in the future. And I just flew today, right before we recorded this, I flew the Air 2S for one of the videos that we're recording. And we did get a bunch of things. And I love the technology. As a manned aircraft pilot myself, I love the fact that people would get a warning when I'm flying around. We tested it around airports, and you get different warnings when you get really close to the drones. What is in that paper that you haven't implemented yet that is something that you want to do in the future? Because I know it was kind of a roadmap to what DJI wants to do in the future. Is there something in there that we need to look forward to coming from DJI, a standard or something similar to AirSense, a commitment to safety? Because I know this is what the paper was all about.
Yes. Thank you for the question. It's been 2 years, and we're sort of talking internally about reflecting on where we've come. I think for us, we've fulfilled what we said we would. We committed to AirSense is ADSB, right? That's airplane and helicopter detectors, basically. It tells you there's a helicopter coming and shows you on the map where it is. And we've seen really good anecdotes of people, getting their drone out of the way. Mm-hmm. So that's great. That was the whole point of that. We also committed to a distance warning. We put that in our product as well. We did call on industry and government to do a few things, and I think those are still not done. So, for example, the FAA is still working on a requirement going back, I think, to 2016. Called Section 2209, which Congress said to FAA, figure out a way for critical sites like power plants to apply to you for a drone-specific flight restriction. And we said that's a good idea because we don't want drones to raise alarm or cause security problems or crash into infrastructure and knock out the power. But we don't, the industry doesn't know where those locations are. DJI would geofence those, but we don't know where they are. FAA was tasked with doing that. They still haven't put out the process, and I think they're going to have to put out rulemaking on the Section 2209, fixed site designation process. I keep hearing, although it's been a while, that rulemaking proposal was supposed to come out this year. Of course, we had a change in administration, so that always delays things. But it could be that we'll see that rulemaking come out in the next few months. And if so, of course, comment on it, because hopefully it will take a very risk-based approach to this issue and designate restrictions only for things that really deserve them. I'm a little concerned. At one point I heard that cities were submitting parks as sites for designations. Obviously, that's not a security concern. That's one thing where we call, one of our 10 points was we really want that, we need that. We also called on other manufacturers to implement remote ID and geofencing. Well, we talked about geofencing already today. Remote ID, okay, only we implemented that ahead of schedule, really 5 years ahead of the mandate, if you think about it. It's a little disappointing no other companies did it, but I understand they're smaller and have other priorities. And now we've got remote ID coming as a mandate, so that's good. We called on government to implement remote ID as a mandate. It's taken too long, but it is finally here, basically. So I think most of the things on our list, I may be forgetting a few, but we've come a long way in the past 2 years. And we still, as an industry, we still have an amazing safety record. In our NPRM comment, we did some calculations based on data voluntarily shared, and I think it was something like 80 million flights in the US in 2019 or something like that. Like, I may be getting the number wrong, but like the fact that here we are, like basically a decade into this, and we have 0 fatal accidents. It really, when you think of how many people are flying drones worldwide, that's an amazing safety record. And I like to think that part of it is the things that we've done as the market leader, geofencing, ADSB, altitude limitations, return to home, like the kinds of things that keep people safer, I think has contributed to that. And that's the good news, is that I'm sitting here 2 years later, and thanks to the safety steps we've taken and people being careful out there, we'll still have an excellent, really perfect safety record, and we just need to keep it that way.
Yeah, and I want to add to this. This is another question I had on my list. I was sitting with the FAA for the last 2 months. The FAA has been inviting us into a few meetings talking about how can we improve the safety culture in the UAS community. And one of the things that I mentioned, and maybe this is something that you can add to version 2.0 of Elevate 2021 when you come up with the new one, is the involvement of manufacturers into helping us educate. I'm in the education side of the industry, and how can we, and this goes back to what we mentioned before, you are a global manufacturer, so this can be a difficulty, but how can we help educate the people that go to Walmart and buy a DJI drone, or even a smaller drone? This is not necessarily just a DJI issue, I think. And tell them when they open the box, these are the things that you have to do. There's only 8 things really on the FAA list for hobbyists that you have to follow. And now you're going to have to take a test. The trust exam is around the corner from the FAA. How can manufacturers, and I'm not asking this as a DJI question, get involved to help the people that just don't know? No.
Well, we'd like to, and we've made efforts to do that. Primarily, about 3 years ago, we implemented our own knowledge quiz in our products, so that people would have to answer a limited set of basic questions about safe operations. That was kind of a little bit of a preview to the trust test, I guess. So now an official test is coming. Obviously, we're going to do a lot of education and socialization of that. I think we have something like 3 million followers in our social media channels. So we definitely want to get the word out and be a good partner with the FAA on that, and with the community. I think word will get around. It's conceivable at some point in the future that we would either link to or put the test inside the technology. But I think that requires, because it's US specific, it requires its own development path. There's some complexities with doing that, but it's possible that when if you're a first time buyer of DJI, you open the product, you're going to get some kind of notice or education on what you need to do to fly legally, including the trust exam. So we'll see. I don't have a more specific answer for you right now. So again, hopefully the educational materials will be out there to help people pass the test, and that's something that we would want to spread and socialize so that people can go out there, get it done, know what the rules are, and then go enjoy the technology.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. I know for a fact for a lot of different people just getting the drone. And I talk to a lot of them just through Pilot Institute on a regular basis. And the fact that, hey, I just didn't know. I didn't know we had to do all of this. It's always kind of a big surprise. So any help I think we can get from you guys as the top #1 manufacturer, I think would help the industry in general.
Sure.
I got a question for you, Brendan. I think it's a year or maybe 2 years ago by now that you guys had in, I think, the DJI offices in Manhattan, a session about the rule that prohibits people from taking off and landing drones or other aircraft, because this is a rule that I think is 70 years old, probably meant for airplanes and maybe even Zeppelins back then. But it still prohibits drones from taking off and landing in New York City. And I think you're only allowed to fly in 5 designated areas in New York. At the same time, they have this building inspection requirement. I think it's for every 5 years you need to manually inspect the facade of every building, the high rises in New York. Seems like a great opportunity for drones to take on some of that work. Do you know where things stand in New York City in terms of that rule, and if maybe that's going to change at some point in time?
Yes, we're seeing some progress. So a few months ago, a bill was passed that studies the use of drones for facade inspection. You are right that in New York, every 5 years, buildings have to be inspected so that pieces don't fall off of them. Unfortunately, about a year and a half ago, a woman who was walking in Times Square was hit in the head and died from a piece of a falling building, and that spurred City Council to look for ways to more efficiently and quickly inspect building facades. And guess what? Like, drones are basically perfect, because instead of setting up all the scaffolding and stuff on the sidewalk that if you've ever been to New York, you see it everywhere. It sits there for like a year or two, just so they can get up there when the time comes to do the inspection. And if they don't do it on time, they put up the scaffolding as a sort of temporary safety measure. Well, then it just sits there. So I think we're seeing New York City realize that there are benefits, and that this 1940s law that says you can't take off or land an aircraft without, except in airports, doesn't make sense for drones. Maybe legally doesn't even apply to them if it were challenged, which so far it hasn't. It's New York. Things take time. It's a busy, complicated place, but I'm optimistic that before too long we'll get to the point where there's a better framework. Again, it's possible that before then, this existing law would be challenged by someone who's being stopped from operating. I know that everyone who's been charged under that has basically had their charges dropped, as far as I know, including that photographer who was flying around Hart Island recording those early COVID-related burials in Potter's Field. So New York's always interesting place to deal with any sort of policy issue. So stay tuned. I think we'll get there, but it will probably make sense for this facade inspection report to be created, showing this just one benefit of many that New York is sort of missing out on by telling companies that they shouldn't fly.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think even for film production as well, a lot of film crews have been going to different cities around the country to get their aerial shots taken there, because in New York they can't fly their drones. I think Greg it's been a little over an hour now that we've been in the podcast. I think Greg has one final question, perhaps, unless Kara, you want to jump in. But I think Greg has one question that we reserve for all our guests at the end of the show. So maybe, Greg, go ahead with that one.
Well, the question is, and I'm going to make it a double question. It's not much longer, but favorite drone to fly. And I want to know how you got into aviation, because you said you've been flying small aircraft, remote aircraft since the 90s. So tell us a little bit more about your aviation background and what's your favorite drone?
Okay, it's a fun question. So I started with the hobby of model aircraft in the mid-90s. I think it was 1994 or 1995. So it's been 25 years or more. Balsa, glue, nitromethane fuel motors. A lot of fun. Much harder to fly than today's drones. So that's just been sort of my lifelong hobby. And then when I was at my law firm in New York, working on tech law stuff, this drone case came along with Raphael Perker, also known as Trappy, and I took on that case and said, hey, look, this is more than just one case. This is really about a whole new industry that needs to be regulated properly. We can't have the FAA or other government officials telling people not to use life-saving technology. There was a case I handled involving the FAA telling a search and rescue organization, a nonprofit in Texas, not to use drones because they didn't have the rules. Like, that's just not acceptable to keep technology back because you haven't created rules. Well, you also haven't created a rule against it. So it just made no sense. So this hobby sort of really turned into a new part of my career when I first became known for those cases, and then left the firm to join DJI. So it's like a mix of really personal passion. Yes, it's fun. It's important. Like, I really feel like these policies we're deciding have made and will make a huge difference. Night operations is going to save lives. I think we should have had it years ago. But, a lot of the drone rescues we're seeing now are at night with thermal cameras. So now that routine night operations exists in the rules, it's going to, the number of rescues we already see, I'm sure, will be doubled easily before too long. So, that's how I got into it, really, is, unmanned, what we now call remote pilot unmanned aircraft systems, but just for fun. Now, favorite. My favorite drone may not be a DJI drone, so I probably should stop there. But I will say of the DJI drones, the new FPV drone is really great. I've been flying FPV, including with the DJI FPV system, probably since 2010. So yeah, it's probably been 10 or 11 years of FPV. And that's actually different from flying a model aircraft. I still like that. But FPV drones are cool. Like, I don't do professional racing, but I enjoy, I guess you might call it freestyle FPV. So to me, the DJI FPV drone is a lot of fun. That's my favorite DJI drone. But I'm not going to tell you what my favorite drone is.
Come on.
Come on.
All right, that's fair enough.
If we have no more questions, then Brendan, thank you so much for joining us on this Friday afternoon. It was a pleasure having you on the show. I think there was a lot of insight, a lot of great questions, and equally great answers that I think our viewers and listeners will definitely appreciate. And I hope you'll be able to get some flying in this weekend. I think the weather here is going to be beautiful, so hopefully you get some time to fly that FPV drone. And yeah, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. I enjoyed the discussion. Take care.